Hi, and welcome back to Wire with Nolin RECC. I'm Sarah Fellows, Communications Manager, and I have a special guest with me today, Buddy Rosenberger. He's one of our longtime board members, and recently, Buddy has announced that you're not going to be running for re-election, and so I wanted to take a chance to just sit down and talk to you a little bit about your time at Nolin. You've given a lot of years here, and you've served our members well for a long time, so I wanted to just get a chance to chat with you about that. So,
but I don't know how well I've served. But anyway, I've served.
You absolutely
almost 45 years.
So. Right. So this will be your 45th year that you're serving in District 1, right?
Yes, ma'am.
So what area does that cover, District 1?
Well, originally, Mr. Earl Templeman was the director from 1, and he was president of Cecilia Bank. And so originally the area was from 86 to the Hardin County line down in Breckenridge County through Cecilia, and then where it hit 62, then it traveled 62 east, and Ring Road wasn't there then.
Right.
But the bypass was, so it went through the bypass, and then north on the bypass, everything on the west side of the bypass, out to 31W, and then 31W through Radcliffe, because we didn't have but 5 directors. So Lawrence Arlen was not a director, so I had all of Radcliffe.
Wow.
And then to the, and then out 144 or whatever the road was going out towards Meade County.
Yeah.
To everybody knows where Otter Creek Tavern is.
Yeah.
There's Otter Creek Tavern, that's where the county line, and then over to 1600 down to Meade County line again. And
wow.
But
that was a big area at the very beginning, wasn't it?
That just shows how thinly populated.
Right.
And of course, KU traveled pretty much the railroad tracks.
Okay.
So Rineyville, Cecilia, Vine Grove. Radcliffe really did not become a community. The fellow that my dad bought the farm I live on in 1955 was owned by T. Brown Logston. And T. Brown Logston's farm, his home farm, was part of Radcliffe. And so Radcliffe really didn't start development until after 1955. And so that's why it's my area, you know, it was a large area, but with only 5 directors, and Bob Wade had Glendale, and then Kennard Peden was the other director, and Kennard lived out a Sportsman's Lake Road down towards Hardin County or whatever, and then Howard Ragland lived in Magnolia, and Lyman Williams lived kind of north of Hodgeville there. And so that was...
So that's how you started. Yeah, but it's changed since then. Now, if you look at the director's map now, you're still up in that upper kind of left-hand corner, you know, the western part of, northwestern part of kind of Hardin County, right?
How you know, the population out in the rural areas, which is not rural anymore.
Right.
And
with the districts, the way Nolin does that, and that's not why we're here to talk, but I want to just real quick so people know, it really is kind of by population.
Yeah,
so you may have a
equalize the population in each area.
So you're not representing, one person's not representing way more people than another. So they kind of sometimes have to revisit that through the years. Okay. So again, you've served as a director, but in that time you've done some other things as a director. So I know you've sat on the East Kentucky board. Can you talk about some of the roles you've served?
Well, originally, Howard Ragland, he was our director on the East Kentucky board. And then I'm not sure what year Howard was not re-elected from his area. They elected a new director. And so at that time, they appointed me as an assistant director in case Howard couldn't go.
Okay.
And so I was assistant director, and I went with the East Kentucky a few times with Howard. And so when Howard wasn't reelected, the board said, well, why don't you just go ahead since you know how to get up there anyway. So.
To represent Nolin on the East Kentucky board,
Yeah.
right? Which, so real quick, just East Kentucky Power is our power provider in Winchester. So you, at that time, then you came into that role of that board member.
Role. And of course, you know, there were 16 distribution systems.
Right.
So there were 16 directors and the managers. And at that time, the manager actually, except for Nolin, and of course, Mr. Tharp was the manager
right.
when I started. And then Mr. Tharp, he retired, and Jack Cargill was assistant manager. And so then Jack started representing, but anyway, there was kind of a period right there between Clem's retirement and all, and so that's why I was assistant director. And so then Jack Cargill was the assistant director, and if I couldn't go, then Jack could go and he could vote.
Oh, okay. But, well, so you've represented Nolin on the board there at East Kentucky. You've also
32 years.
That's right. So that was a pretty good chunk of your time as a director here, and you've served as a specific role in the on the Nolin board too, right?
Well, you know, of course Howard was secretary, and then when we made 6 directors, then Gene Straney was secretary, and when anyway, then Gene moved up to vice chairman with Bob Wade, and then I was selected as the secretary treasurer.
Okay, so
and I was, for a period of time, I was a secretary treasurer on East Kentucky's board.
Okay.
Also.
So you've served in a lot of kind of different roles, even as your one role as director. So how has the co-op changed? I know that obviously the land around here has changed. You talked about it kind of going from, you know, far more rural to way more populated now than it, you know, more developments. But in terms of the co-op, like what have you seen that's changed the most?
Well, of course, during that period of time, Nolin's office was down on 031W. The pole yard, they didn't have a lot of land, and so the pole yard was behind the office. And so during Jack Cargill's tenure as manager, Nolin started looking for another area. And so there were several areas they looked at, and finally they just selected this area right here. Mm-hmm. And Nolin purchased this, and of course, subsequently sold the area that they originally had the office in. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure how many years we've been in this new area here, but
I know it was built. It was finished in the mid-90s, right around in there. So it's been a while.
Yeah. And of course, with the area increasing in size and the number of members, there's a lot. They needed a larger area for the pole yard and vehicles and everything else.
Oh yeah.
And so it would have been impossible to serve the area where it is now from that old area.
Yeah, well, if people aren't familiar with that, the old office is across from where Warm Blessings is now, and it's really kind of landlocked right there.
Yeah, well, yeah, there's a little grocery store. I know, and of course for our lunch, usually our meetings would go over lunch hour, and so a lot of them would order dressed ham sandwiches and all this, and they used to make fun of me because I would always get just a liver cheese and bologna with mayonnaise, and that was fine for me. So
I have heard of your love of bologna. I've heard that. So in changing in terms of just, you know, what the co-op has looked like physically, and then looking at the land, talking about the development. I mean, obviously we're in a time of significant amount of development here, but you've seen a lot since you moved, and I know you weren't originally from where you are now, the farm that you and your wife live on.
No, I grew up on a farm, and people say, "Oh, you lived in Louisville." I said, "No, it wasn't Louisville then. It was
not like people think of Louisville now, right? Yeah.
Valley Station.
Yeah.
and it was in the southwestern part of Jefferson County. And our house, it was an old brick house, and all the old brick houses faced the river, because the river was the main transportation. If you had animals or to ship to the stockyards, they had what they called a drawbridge that they'd pull up and they'd let it down. Farmers would drive the cattle. Or if you lived close to a railroad, but the railroad was quite a distance from where we lived, and so our house was probably much over 100 yards from the Ohio River. So that's where I grew up. And you know, there's advantages, but there's disadvantages. In 1937, because that was 2 years before I was born, the Ohio River was 5 foot deep in our house. And
I was going to say,
all my dad's horses and
all that's awful.
7 and
that's awful.
and but that's part of life.
That's right. I mean, I guess that's part of farming and part of living that close to a river. My goodness. So then I know you and your wife married. You have the farm here out in.
And then after 1937, Louisville planned to build a flood wall to protect the next time it had a flood. So they built a flood wall, and eventually it went right across our farm where I grew up.
Oh wow!
And they wouldn't allow you to drive livestock or pasture on that flood wall and things like that. So my dad and them started milking cows about 1930, right after the Depression, because you had to have some income, and every farm or household, whatever, had a milk cow, and you had to have enough milk to fill a 10-gallon can. And so they bought enough cows from neighbors as they could do that, so they'd have some income, because nobody had any money to buy it. They mainly raised vegetables, tomatoes, lettuce, radishes, and things like that, just truck garden. And so my dad said, in 1965, Carol Ann and I married, and he said, do you want to take these cows? And they had purchased a farm down here in 1955, but they we never lived down here or anything, and come down here, and he'd put me up a silo and a milking parlor, and the rest of it, if I made a go of it, then I could, whatever. If I didn't, then that's all the expensive they had. So Carol Ann and I, we came down here in November of 1965.
And you made a go of it.
And, well,
you're still there, right?
We're still working at that goal. So.
Well, I know. So I know you've seen that land. I mean, to have moved there in the '60s, to know, I know we've talked previously when we did another column about how it changed the landscape there, though. Having so many more people in that area, and it feels less rural, and you made that comment earlier. So is that one of the biggest changes you think you've seen?
And you're talking about changes. Originally, when the REA came in, they got real low rate loans, and so they could serve rural areas. And they said, but you have to serve anybody who wants electricity and can pay. You have to serve them. So they pretty much ran the lines as the crow flies, not along the roads, across fields, over hills, whatever.
Right. Shortest distance between two places, right?
And but that was the cheapest way, but that wasn't the easiest way to maintain them.
Right.
And so you have your electricity. I mean, it really didn't go out any more frequent than it did up at Valley Station, where it was on LG&E. But it was just hard to maintain. So during Jack Cargill's, when he was manager, he had plans to run the lines along in areas along the roads,
right,
so that Nolin could maintain the lines, and so it's really been a big benefit in our area, because with new poles and lines along the road, our electricity is very seldom ever out.
It's so much easier,
and they did that not just in our area, but a lot of the areas. And
Well-
so that was one of the big changes. And
I think that's a really interesting thing for people to think about, because like during the windstorm, for example, when we had to, some of our trucks were trying to get in some kind of hard to reach places, and you wonder, well, why are there poles and lines there? But I think that's a really good thing to point out in terms of why it was originally there. When you're able to move them out to the road, but not all of them are there. So that's a really good point to
kind of
make.
interesting story. A neighbor of ours, he lives out. There's a big hill. I showed Sarah, Blue Ball Hill.
That's right.
And
you can
so,
see for miles.
Mr. Willis Williard, bless his heart, he's passed away now, but he said, I guess it was like 1938 is when they received electricity or they put out the lines. But you had to have 5 people that wanted electricity. And of course, they had to run a line over Blue Ball Hill because Mr. Williard's farm and his house was on the west side. And another fellow was Solly Knoll. And so Mr. Williard's dad said, well, I'd like to have electricity. But it was only like maybe 3 people. And so he said, okay, I'll pay for 2. And he went to Mr. Knoll and he said, would you sign up? And Mr. Knoll said, well, people had never had electricity, so they didn't see any advantage.
Sure.
And he said, well, I'll probably never hook up, never turn the lights on or anything. But he said, if you would like electricity, I'll go ahead and pay another I think it was $5 they had to pay. And so I thought that was interesting. And of course, usually all they did was hang one light card down in the center of the kitchen or whatever.
Yeah.
Put a light bulb on it. And so they ran the electricity over Blue Ball Hill to Mr. Williard.
To get to Mr. Williard.
Yeah.
Now, did the other man ever use his light bulb? Do you know?
But,
I bet he did. I bet he did. So what has been, outside of just kind of navigating all of those changes, what has been the most challenging part for you to be involved in the co-op, to be a co-op director?
Well, Nolin has always had wonderful employees. And if there were challenges, and I'm sure, there were a lot more challenges to the employees. And but they pretty much, I don't really, can't really think of a really big challenge because everything was really well planned with the wonderful employees and the wonderful work conditions. And I noticed one of the recent emails we get from the NRECC, and I think it's up in Wisconsin, and because they have problems maintaining employees and getting new employees.
Wow.
And I don't think that's, thank goodness it's been a problem because we've always had, wonderful managers and wonderful staff and like Sarah, and it's just.
I'll pay you later for that thing.
Nolin is just, and Nolin is looked up to with the other 16 systems, or the other 15 systems in East Kentucky's area, and in the systems in Big Rivers area also.
So. Well, that's good to hear. Well, it's because we have good directors too.
Well.
So what do you hope, and I know you're stepping off the board, and that makes all of us very sad, but what do you hope for in the future? How do you see kind of things moving forward, beyond your years?
Well, what's in the future, the technology, the little cell phones we have today, when I went on board, they weren't available.
Right.
And
right.
I remember this one director from Farmers at East Kentucky, and he would come, and he had this great big, like a brick thing, and he put it on the table, and that was a cell phone. That was a cell phone.
Oh yeah,
and but the technology today is like you don't have to read your meter anymore, and you really don't even need to call in if your electricity.
That's right.
Because Nolin has a 24-hour people sitting, and if your electricity goes out, they know right then. He quits blinking or whatever.
That's right.
From your meter.
That's
and,
right.
And these things are just, you know, they're, if you talked about them 30 years ago,
Oh,
or
yeah.
I mean, you know, it's kind of like those movies you watch Star Wars, whatever it is. You know,
Right. We got flying cars out there or whatever. Yeah. So really, we're looking at a future of probably a lot of changes, and I think one of the really great things about the directors and the leadership at Nolin is that they've helped us to be flexible. That, you know, as things come at the electrical industry, that the board of directors and leadership here have been really flexible about, okay, how do we move forward with that? You know, how do we take what's changing and change with it? Because, you know, and you've done that since your first few days here, I'm sure, at the co-op, that you just learn what you have to learn and help the co-op change and grow, you know, into the future.
Yeah. Well, in most cases, you know, if the suggestions or ideas that were brought to the board from staff, we knew they were well thought out, and usually we went along with them. I can't think of any case that we did not go along with suggestions or new ideas from staff or from whatever. So, because we knew they were well thought out.
Well, and that's made it a great work environment. It really has, because you don't feel like the board's gonna, you know, shoot down an idea because they don't understand it, because you all learn about it and really believe in the people that serve Nolin. So we appreciate that as employees. But in terms of what you think you'll miss the most, and again, you're going to be a member, so you'll always be part of Nolin, but what do you think you'll miss being a director?
Well, naturally, you make, you know, a lot of friends at East Kentucky when I was on that board, you know, and it was, of course, Nolin, we're all pretty much the same culture. But 30 years ago, there was a different culture between far eastern Kentucky and the western part of the Kentucky, although we're not considered western here at Nolin, but kind of central area. But you know, just the different, just making friends in different areas, and of course naturally, when we come in at a board meeting for Nolin, you know, just the camaraderie you have with the fellow directors, and we all seem to get along. Although I probably do more kidding than I should have.
Well, we appreciate all the years that you have put into Nolin and to the members here. And one of the things that's always impressed me about you is what a good heart that you have, and how earnestly you want to serve this co-op. And it's just a part of who you are, and I've appreciated that, getting to know you, and I know the co-op has been a better place for it. So thanks for sitting down and talking to me. It wasn't too bad, was it?
No, I
okay.
enjoyed it.
Thank you for joining us for Wire to Wire with Nolin RECC.